all these armies handily. And suddenly they were almost defeated in the war, almost lost the country or their state. And this, for most Israelis, was quite a shock. And what happened was, and this is a recurring trend in Israeli society, and not only Israeli society, is whenever there was an external threat, some kind of war, somebody from the outside, all the internal voices of dissent, all social issues are quieted. People feel like they need to gather together. They can't afford to deal with all these issues. They have to, protect the very basic things, and anything else is kind of weakening us. And that's why, or the main reason why the Black Panthers issue, the discrimination, the stuff that they were raising was almost completely silenced, and eventually led to sort of the slow fizzle of the Black Panthers movement. The other thing that led to it, also, this wasn't the only reason, was that the people who were running the movement were very young youth from Musraba, and they had a very hard time sustaining such a large movement, so much energy over a large period of time, considering that they had very few tools, that very few of them had finished their education, they had very little support inside the country, very little support outside the country, and weren't helped by the fact that they were repressed very much by the police, by the different forces, arrested, detained, tortured, and also there was a very effective use of informers inside the group. The secret services would infiltrate the group, very similar to the American Black Panthers in that sense. And buy people out, and also sort of sabotage different activities. So much so that by the end of their days, the last meetings, a lot of the meetings were more about who's collaborating and who you can talk with and who you can't talk with, rather than actually doing something. The movement went underground for some time. But nevertheless, they had a very strong effect on the Israeli political scene up until today. Firstly, in the formal political sort of sphere. In the late 1970s, there was a big political change in this country, where after 60 years of rule of the Zionist Labour Party, the Likud, the sort of right-wing liberal party, came into power. And one of the main reasons was their leader, Menachem Begin, was a very smart political leader. Very early on, even before the days of Black Panthers, he would talk directly to the Middle Eastern Jews and say to them, we know what the Labour Party is doing to you. We know you're suffering, and we want you to know that we appreciate your service to the country as settlers, as Jews living here, as soldiers, what you've contributed in the wars, and we want you to know that our party is open for you. You can join our party. And he didn't just talk, the Likud opened up their ranks, the Middle Eastern Jews, which in the other parties were very much closed.
So is there a little bit of an animosity between European Jews living here and Middle Eastern Jews?
Yeah, there is a little bit.
See, I never knew that. I didn't know that.
There you go. That's why you come into it.
Yeah.
As referring to what you said, so what happened was that by the end of the 1970s, the Likud overwhelmingly was supported by Middle Eastern Jews, who were the majority of the population then, and that allowed them to win the victory, the elections, and almost all the elections since then. But what happened was at the end of the 80s, after 10 years of Likud rule, the Middle Eastern Jews were beginning to by the end of the 1980s, this is Kamal, who teaches ney in school. He's an amazing ney player. Ney is like the Arabic Persian flute. In any case, by the end of the 80s, they were beginning to be disillusioned, Middle Eastern Jews, by the Likud, who've been in power for 10 years, and not much change for Middle Eastern Jews. They were still living in poverty, very similar conditions to what they were before. And right around that time, there was a smallest party set up by Middle Eastern Jews who grew up in ultra-Orthodox institutions, religious institutions. And there they were very much oppressed by the European Jews. Till this day, really. There's still segregated classes, all these things that if you read the Israeli news, you'd hear about. And they wanted to highlight that, and they were able to get a small following, get into the Knesset, into the parliament. As a small party in the Israeli system, they had some power, so they got into government. Through that, were able to sustain some funding for their institutions, most of which were social welfare institutions, so meal programs for kids, daycares for working women, religious institutions for after-school studies. And by building up these institutions, they were able to build up a lot of support for their party very quickly. So much so that by the sort of middle of the 1990s, they were already the third biggest party in Israel, and till this day are usually, in most elections, the third biggest party in Israel, even, and they're supported by most of the Middle Eastern Jews, even though they represent a very small sect of Middle Eastern Jews who grew up in ultra-Orthodox institutions. But they're seen as the only true, authentic Middle Eastern voice, and that's why they have a strong following in the Knesset, in the parliament. So that's on the official political scene, the effect that the Black Panthers had. On the much more direct effect of some of their values was actually in the civil society, what we call civil society, not the official politics, but groups doing work inside society. And these different groups, like for example the Democratic Mizrahi Rainbow, one of these groups, that does work on social issues, social inequality between Middle Eastern and European Jews. Now, social inequality between Middle Eastern Jews and European Jews today is different than then. It's not as much discrimination directly. But, for example, they looked at land. They said, okay, let's look at how the land is distributed in Israel today. And they said, okay, and this was in the 90s, and this was a time when kibbutzim, the agricultural collectives, were being privatized. And they noticed that those kibbutzim were able to make a lot of money off state land that was being privatized, and they were getting dividends from, by making industrial zones, things like that. While at the same time, during this privatization, Middle Eastern Jews were forced out of their government-funded apartments. Low-cost apartments, very small apartments, because they were given to private companies. They were forced out. So one person was making money, the other wasn't, and it had to do with an ethnic table. So there were groups doing works on things like that. There were also groups doing work on things like culture, Middle Eastern culture in Israel. For example, this institute, which is the only institute in Israel teaching the classical Middle Eastern Jewish, not just Jewish, but classical Middle Eastern music, Arabic, Persian, and Turkish music, classical music cultures of the Middle East, and some related ones too, like flamenco and even Indian music. And it's quite ironic that this is the only institution, because about 60% of the population in Israel is from the Middle East, 50% of the Jewish population, 20% Palestinian citizens. And this again has to do with the discrimination. And the school checked, and this is a school where I studied, so this is how I know. I'm also a member of the board now of the school. And the school checked to see how much budget, the Israeli official budget, goes to Middle Eastern music and how much goes to European music. And what they found was that 99% of the budget goes to European classical music institutions, and 1% goes to Middle Eastern, even though 60% of the population is Middle Eastern, 40%. So even if it's completely skewed and you times it by 10, it'd still be 10% for the 60% and 90% for 40% of the population. So huge discrepancy, and that's why we say today that the discrimination is not as much as it used to be Middle Eastern Jews and European Jews, though that still exists, but much more Middle Eastern culture and Middle Eastern as opposed to European culture. And Israel still very much sees itself as a Europeanized culture. And the principal of the school, he likes to say, how can we ever imagine there being peace when the leaders meet and they can't even speak each other's language? Not just the formal language, because you have translators for that, Hebrew and Arabic. But also that most of or almost all the representatives of Israel are always European Jews who know little about Middle Eastern culture. And when they come to talk, even if they understand the words, they don't understand the meaning, because culture is a language.
And the current Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, was born and went to school in Bensalem, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I don't think he was born, but yeah. He was
or at least went to school in Bensalem. It's very Americanized.
Um,
Is it almost like an outsider coming into the country and... Somewhat. I mean, not that's, but it is.
Yeah. In any case, so and so that's why the school has a very important function in that sense, of allowing European Jews like me to learn that language, allowing Middle Eastern Jews to sort of find their culture, because of all of what we talked about, a lot of it has been erased. And it's a very important institution in that sense. So, without saying too much more, and very much linked to the Black Panthers.
And you talked about Middle Eastern Jews, and you talked about European Jews. What about American Jews? Are they a different breed as well?
They're more foreign than most people, but we would classify them under European Jews.
European Jews. Okay, cool.
Most of them have a European culture.
Yep.
We're going to go have a look at